So this week you guys will be thinking about the power of reading and the impact that it had on one of the particular authors from their vignette and how the impact of reading had on your own life. But very quickly, I just wanted to go through some research that Stephen Krashen had done. It's The Power of Reading, Insights from the Research. And these were observations and reflections from a faculty from 2004, but they still exist now. So if we think about, Stephen Krashen was all about free voluntary reading. So the research says that FVR is effective in improving reading, is pleasurable, results in superior general knowledge, improves spelling, writing, grammar, helps ELL learners dramatically, improves scores on reading tests and other subject matters, results in better reading comprehension, writing style, and increased vocabulary, develops better thinkers, works when students truly have choice, when the program is consistent and continued, and when teachers are also reading when the students are reading. So that's what research is telling us. However, if you've been in any of the public schools, especially in Arkansas, it's all about the testing. And that is something that throughout the last several years, I spent 17 years as a school librarian. And I will say at the very beginning, I started at a high school and we had a research library, which meant that at the high school level, 10th, 11th, and 12th, they didn't come in just for pleasure reading for the most part. I had a few students that did, but it was primarily, my library existed when I first got there, primarily for classes to come in and conduct research, because you have to think about it. 17 years ago, we had maybe 5 computers total. We didn't, everyone wasn't connected. The internet existed, of course, but we used more print back then just because we didn't have the resources. But then fast forward a little bit, I spent 3 or 4 years doing that, and then I moved into a middle school, Greenbrier Middle School specifically, and we had accelerated reader, and our literacy teachers, 5th, 6th, and 7th grade, were all going through or had just gone through the Lit Lab as a model. So everything was about reading and reading for enjoyment and doing little book literacy circles, and it was wonderful. I was a little bit out of my element just because I had come from, a science background, 9th grade science. That's what I taught first. And then I moved into that high school library, and then I was there with all of these people that loved to read. And the odd thing was, as a elementary student, middle school student, and even a high school student, I read voraciously. I loved to read, and I always did, but I never thought about being a librarian. But that's what our research tells us. But if you think about it, now, after No Child Left Behind, it all became about test scores, and it's all about informational text. And then Common Core came out, and it was all about informational text and finding evidence. And it really saddens me to think about, the library as being, it shifted from being all about reading and literacy to technology. And don't get me wrong, technology definitely has a place, but we need to remember our old hat of finding a love of literature again. So what can we do? We as a collective faculty, not just the school librarian, we need school-wide SSR, silent sustained reading. Classrooms need individual classroom silent sustained reading. When I was first starting at Greenbrier, that was something that every class was expected to do, all the way down even to the math class, the PE class. That first 10 minutes of each class period was supposed to be spent in silent sustained reading. And one of the things, though, that I noticed, it worked in some classrooms just very well. But others, the teachers did not stop what they were doing. They instead were, working on finishing up their lesson plan that they were going to do for the next 40 minutes or whatever after it was done. They were taking roll. They were doing all of those things. And I found myself, even when I was involved, I would be thinking of other things. And I finally realized I needed to take part. The students needed to see me reading. And they wanted to know what I was reading. We need to have a variety of books available for low-level readers. Those graphic novels, those series books, Even if you're in a middle school and a high school, you need to find things that everyone can have access to or that they're interested in. And a lot of times once they find those lower level books and they get more confident as a reader, they'll move up. Publicize suggested reading lists. Survey kids about their reading interests. The librarian needs to put out a list of kids' favorite books and their interests. And that was something, it's a super easy bulletin board. Every year during Teen Read Week, I would poll the 7th graders and, survey and find out what the top 10 list was. And I'd publish it, and I kept it from year to year. And so throughout 4 or 5 years, after 4 or 5 years went by, I would do the bulletin board and I would put up the the top 10 from each year, and you could see the shift. And those 5th and 6th graders that I had even then, they would look at those lists and want to read what the 7th graders were reading. Encourage your teachers to develop in-class libraries. Solicit books through the newsletters, civic groups. You need to try to get as many books as you can. Establish a reading as reward system. Now, I don't always agree with that. I do see the benefits of accelerated reader and some extrinsic motivation, but eventually you want that intrinsic motivation. But it is good, especially at the middle level. I kind of feel like that's a make or break you time period for kids. If there is some kind of reward, they may continue to do it, and then it sparks that love and it continues. Encourage your students to read aloud in class. Some kids do it very well and others don't, but you have to practice. Read aloud to special ed and ELL students. They are like sponges. They'll soak it in. They may not be able to access the text and comprehend as they read, but a lot of times it's just a different way of learning when they can listen. So audiobooks are huge. Talk about reading with your colleagues and your students. Extend the library hours. Talk to a Kiwanis Club or other groups by providing funding or volunteers. So the next slide, the power of reading and vocabulary development, what the research says. Vocabulary is best developed through real encounters with the words in context over time and in small doses. Acquiring a word requires acquiring all of its subtle and complex qualities. Hard to teach with direct instruction. Time spent teaching vocabulary lists could be better spent doing free voluntary reading, more likely as a result in word acquisition. Now, I will say at the lowest levels, I think there needs to be a balance between phonetic reading and spelling. Students need to learn the basic spelling rules. They need to know that. So I do think that there does need to be at least some direct instruction, but as it progresses, you need to start balancing those also with, time on task, just reading. Some of the things that they were saying we can do, eliminate or reduce the vocabulary lists and tests. I do agree with that to an extent. However, thinking about science classes, if you can learn Latin roots and some of those vocabulary rules, then I think that will help the students in the long run learn those science vocabulary terms. But you can also do it in your social studies classes as well. Provide in-context vocabulary through the reading of paragraphs. Evaluate the level of vocabulary we expect students to attain. Have priorities. Know what matters with your students. Don't stick to that list just because you've always done it. Vary the vocabulary input between additional readings and other avenues. Maybe use some short excerpts to introduce new words, but you can also use some online tools that are some vocabulary builders. Provide more free reading time and greater access to books. That's the bottom line, whether you're in a classroom or in a... So the power of reading and spelling. Research says more reading equals better spelling. Free voluntary reading is just as effective or more effective than teaching spelling by direct instruction. Uninstructed students learn to spell just as well as instructed students when given time for free voluntary reading. I think that is true if they have the background knowledge rather than only teaching it through free voluntary reading. Children can spell a substantial number of words they haven't been directly taught. Each word taught through direct instruction requires 20 minutes of time. That, I think, is time well spent. I still think you need to do some of that direct instruction. So what can we do? Again, provide more time for reading, replace spelling practice and instruction with free reading. I think, yes, to a certain degree, encourage students to spell correctly in all situations to avoid developing bad habits, such as those they often develop using email. And this is critical in our middle school level. Typically, it was thought that it was only the literacy teachers that needed to take off for spelling. And Greenbrier had a huge push, and we had lots of discussions in our team meetings. And finally, it was agreed science, social studies, math, any of those times needed to require students to spell correctly. Especially with all of the research projects and papers kids were doing, they needed to make sure that they were still being held accountable for their spelling. Okay, which brings us to the power of reading and libraries. So what the research says, better school libraries result in more reading. The more hours a library is open, the more reading is done by students. More planned trips to the library with the teacher and the class results in more reading. The physical environment of the library contributes to how much reading is done. Size of school library is an accurate predictor of reading test scores. The more money invested in the school library, the higher the test scores. The higher the quality of the library staff, the better the achievement of the students. Unlimited checkouts and book displays results in more reading. So what can we do in our school library? Well, you could increase the library hours before and after school, and that's kind of a tricky subject. But if you can offer before and after school tutoring within your library, and maybe once a week, or find a grant or something to pay for those hours, I think that's a great idea. Or if you want to volunteer an hour of your time, typically I was in my library after school anyway, so a lot of times I had people that would stop in if they needed to finish a paper or a project. And before school, we did start doing homework club. Technically, I was supposed to be open anyway before the kids were there. Now, I didn't have to be on campus until 7:30, but school didn't start until 8. So when they started talking, and I'm talking about the teachers, the faculty as a whole, they said it would be a good idea to offer a homework club. So they were talking about where to house it, and somebody suggested the library, and I said, absolutely, I have to be in there anyway. And I had students that would come in and check in or out a book, but why not go ahead and offer, the library had a larger space. One of the other teachers, it was it was literacy or math. They for sure every day had either a math or a literacy teacher scheduled for their, morning duty in homework club with me. That way I could do my library, circulation things, but I could also help anyway. But there was a math or a literacy teacher in there to provide, true instruction, especially with math. And I know how to do math, but sometimes it was hard for me to relay to a student how to teach it. So I was always thankful, especially on those math days. And the way that they scheduled it, math classes typically had homework assigned like on a Tuesday or a Wednesday night. So typically Thursday and Friday would be the math days. Two different math teachers would come in those days, and literacy was more Monday, Tuesday, and maybe they alternated Wednesdays. I really don't remember, but it really, really worked. Increase your high interest, low level in ELL collections. And that was something a few years ago we had a big push. So I worked on my 400s, the languages, and I tried to find as many bilingual texts as I could. The problem with our ELL students, a lot of times they don't know the vocabulary very well, so they can't read, a bigger book, like if I got The Hunger Games as a dual text, but, they didn't want to carry around a baby book. So, I tried to find some high interest but lower level that would help with those vocabulary terms. Encourage collaboration with the teachers besides the English and the social studies. Science was I loved when the science classes came. There was all kinds of research, and even the PE classes and the art classes, they were doing projects as well that I could offer some services that maybe they didn't know existed. Increase your school library collection to at least have 18 books per student. That would be a great way to provide more opportunities for reading for your kids. Find additional sources of funding for your library. You could look at civic groups, grants, but also just look at, doing your book fairs and even book orders. That was something at the middle school. Some of the middle school kids talked about just doing the scholastic book orders, and I think a lot of the literacy teachers started doing it, and then they kind of went by the wayside, and the kids talked about, I miss getting those little flyers. Well, I'd get them in my box, so I'd offer them, anytime a class came to the library, and sometimes I'd have kids the next day turn in, and I would just, do the book orders. And then the last one is specific for this group of teachers that was putting this together. They thought, if they built a library at the alternative school, which was Burlington North, that, that would help promote reading within their own district. So specifically, how can we encourage the power of reading and affect our English language learners? So the research says developing literacy in first language is key to developing literacy in the new language. Free voluntary reading improves attitudes about reading among the ELL students. Light reading materials such as comics and romances can be elemental in providing easy, enjoyable reading for your ELL kids. I'd call those kind of our bubblegum reads, and I think that was a term that a professor had said at Harding, and I liked that term. ELL students can improve their reading, spelling, and comprehension through that free voluntary reading. Students who read for pleasure in their heritage language have better retention of that language than students who don't. And that's something that I think sometimes we forget, is that their native language is going to be important to them. We want them, to just kind of dive right in and be able to access and speak the English language when, in reality it is going to take years for them. So what can we do? We can make more high-interest, low-level ELL books available in our library, schedule more time for ELL classes to visit the library, provide more time for ELL to just read. That practice is key. Teachers need to be aware of whether ELL are literate in their heritage language, and I think, like I said, sometimes we don't even check that. We just want to get them over into English. We do need to provide more books in Spanish and visit the public library with those ELL students and let their parents know what is available. So the power of reading and reading aloud with the research. When a teacher reads aloud and discusses stories with the students tend to read more. The students who are read aloud to check out more library books. Hearing stories and discussing them encourages independent reading. Hearing stories has a direct impact on vocabulary development, because if you think about it, sometimes as a kid, when I was reading something, I didn't know how to pronounce it, and a lot of times I didn't go over and get the dictionary to look at the diacritical marks and see, even though I'm completely enamored. I love diacritical marks, and I love looking at how to pronounce things, but, as a kid I didn't really, and so sometimes I would mispronounce a word because I had read it for years and never heard it out loud. So, that definitely helps with vocabulary development. Children who are read aloud to at least 3 times a week read better, and students enjoy being read to. Even the older kids enjoy it, maybe not all the time, but listening in the car to books, for me, is therapeutic, and I like it. Now, if I'm not driving, or, I'm just sitting, I would prefer the printed text over an auditory book, but if I'm walking, or trying to exercise, or, like I said, just kind of driving, I really enjoy audiobooks. What we can do, we can read aloud to our students in all classes across the curriculum. And it doesn't have to be a novel. It could be, even just pieces out of a text, or it could be, a periodical article or even a newspaper article. Read even short pieces, such as newspaper articles. Ask the librarian for help in finding things to read aloud. And that would be for a regular classroom teacher. We, as the librarians, can help provide what would make a good read aloud. Find and read stories with suspense about our topics in your area. Think about it with science and criminology. You can incorporate so many read alouds in all different content areas. Read articles, Are We Reading to Our Teens? In a book report from June 2000. And no, you don't need to ask Kathy Belbin for a copy. Again, that was specifically from that school doing this. But if you can locate a copy, it was a great article in book report. Power of Reading and Light Reading comic books. This is that bubblegum read. And evidence suggests that light reading leads to more serious reading. Those who read more comic books also read more other books too. Reading comic books is associated with greater enjoyment of reading in general, and we're talking graphic novels as well. Comic books play an important role in helping readers gain confidence and learn to enjoy reading. Comic books often introduce new sophisticated vocabulary. For me, comic books are distracting. There's sometimes I have a hard time reading, with the picture, with the captions, but I think it's great for a lot of readers who really enjoy all of the visuals. But what can we do? You can allow comic book reading during that free voluntary reading. Build a graphic novel collection in your library. Encourage all types of reading, not just the classics. Provide light reading, such as Reader's Digest, magazines, and other books like the Chicken Soup for the Teen Soul. Some of those short story collections were huge that some of my students really wanted to read because they were shorter and they felt like, when they finished one of those, they were done, instead of having to get through an entire novel. So concentrate on serving all populations, especially your special ed and your lower level readers. Don't forget about your self-contained SPED population. Sometimes they kind of get left out of everything. And then consider the philosophy. This was from that school, but I think it's a great one. Is it to have your students read anything, read specific things, or a combination of both? So think about it. Think about how you can provide that bridge for those students, because the power of reading has been powerful to all of us. Remember when you get into your library, if you're not already there, that the reading, the literature part, the love of reading needs to still be intertwined with the technology, with all of the other hats that we wear. So don't forget about those, creating those recreational programs and different opportunities in your library to help spur that love of reading and give that power back to reading for enjoyment. So think about what else you can do. How can you promote reading? How can you model reading? And overall, how can you, as the school librarian, help students see its value and enjoyment? So have a great week. I look forward to hearing your Power of Reading connections.